unabashed,
the most unpredictable,
becomes a headline,
the most volatile,
outrageous behavior,
unsubstantiated narratives,
a battle of personalities.
Welcome to a special happy hour edition of Grand Tamasha. I'm your host, Milan Vaishnav of the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. It is 4:30 p.m. on Monday, April 20th. I'm recording from my bedroom, actually under the covers to muffle the sound here in Washington, D.C. Today, we are getting happy hour started early with podcast regular Sadanand Dhume of the American Enterprise Institute and the Wall Street Journal, and Tanvi Madan of the Brookings Institution. Guys, welcome to our COVID-approved virtual happy hour / podcast mashup.
Good to be back.
Good to be back. Sad to be so socially distanced, though.
So we're going to talk about that. But before we get things started, let's begin with the essentials. As you're sitting at home preparing to pontificate, Sadanand, what adult beverage are you enjoying right now?
I have in my hand a very nice, if I may say so myself, old-fashioned, made with bourbon, orange bitters, a little brown sugar, and a nice hunk of ice. I will share a selfie of myself with it later.
Wow, that sounds very elegant. And Dr. Madan, what are you having right now?
I am having a good old G&T, a gin and tonic with some gin. I acquired, this is one of the new Goa boutique gins, which Constantino Xavier was good enough to procure for me from Goa, and I picked up the last time I was in Delhi. And some pretty regular tonic, none of the fancy stuff we get these days, and not with the kind of quinine-like properties that anti-malarials have, but nonetheless, I felt that this is very on theme. And we have to celebrate is this your, I don't know if it's your 51st or 52nd show, but congratulations on the half century. And to those who know cricket, that's a very Rahul Dravid-like performance, very solid, very steady, and no doubt headed for a century.
Thank you very much, Tanvi. It is the 51st episode, and as we're recording, you can probably hear my dogs barking in the background, so they're adding their congratulations. I am drinking a DC Brow, the Public, locally made beer here in Washington, D.C., which is pretty good, I have to say. It's nice and refreshing on this kind of seasonably warm day. I miss seeing you guys both in person, but thanks as always for coming on the show. Today, we're going to discuss 3 topics. First, India is in the midst of an unprecedented 5-week nationwide lockdown. We'll discuss how the country is doing in its battle against COVID-19. Next, we'll discuss the growing anti-China sentiment that's been brewing in India for quite a while now, as many Indians seek to pin the blame on China for hiding the true nature of the coronavirus threat. Over the weekend, the government announced some new restrictions on foreign investment. Those appear largely aimed at protecting India against Chinese meddling in Indian corporate affairs. We'll discuss that a little bit more. And last but not least, we will discuss what impact COVID-19 is having on India's domestic politics. But let's get started with India's ongoing battle to contain the coronavirus. At the time of recording, India has about 14,000 reported COVID cases and 560, give or take, confirmed COVID deaths. New cases, according to the economist Shamika Ravi of Brookings, are doubling roughly every 10 days or so. Having said that, India is still testing relatively few people on a per capita basis, so it's sort of hard, to put too much stock, I think, into the reported figures. Sadanand, let me start with you. Tell us a little bit about where things stand in India today. In the Wall Street Journal last week, you had this to say on a quote: "In the haze of uncertainty around the pandemic, you could patch together an optimistic scenario in which everything goes just right in India." Is that, in your view, a likely scenario?
It's a great question, Milan. I think that, one of the things that I've struggled with as a columnist, like I think many people, is that this is very new terrain. So I have to start with a caveat and point out that I'm not any kind of expert on this, though I have been speaking with many experts over the past few weeks. And if you look at India, one of the things that's interesting, I just looked at this data before coming online, is that India has, I think the figures I saw as of Monday evening, our time in the United States, fewer than 18,000 cases and fewer than 600 deaths. If you look at it in terms of number of cases, it is number 17 in the world. India, even though it has 1.3 billion people, has fewer cases than Portugal and Switzerland. much, much smaller countries. Now, one of the things, of course, which you alluded to is the question of testing, and whether if there was much more testing, we would in fact be seeing many more cases. But either way, one thing that seems quite clear is that the number of deaths we've seen in India has been quite small. And there are all kinds of theories doing the rounds out there. A lot of these are academic papers, not necessarily peer-reviewed papers at this point. But some of the prominent ones are that perhaps India will be able to dodge the COVID bullet because the virus does not survive easily in warm weather and high degrees of and a high amount of humidity in some parts of India. Some people say that because Indians have routinely been inoculated with the BCG vaccine against tuberculosis, which is much more common that vaccination is much more common in the developing world and in rich countries, that may explain the relatively low figures that we're seeing. Some people point to the fact that India's age demographic is quite dramatically different from places like Italy and the US. Only 6% of Indians are above the age of 65. And so if you sort of take all of these things together, some people also talk about the fact that Indians, because they're exposed to many different kinds of diseases, have kind of a high level of immunity. And if you take these things together, you could argue that maybe what we're seeing in India is not such an anomaly. Maybe India isn't merely lower down on the curve or earlier in the cycle, but maybe India is going to experience this disease in a much less dramatic fashion than other countries have. Now, I myself am skeptical of this, and most of the people I spoke with, the experts I spoke with, are also skeptical of it. And they say that these theories are, some of these may end up being true, but in general, the evidence for them ranges from weak to inconclusive. We simply don't know enough about the effects of the BCG vaccine, for example. Oh, the other one that I forgot to mention is that India is the largest manufacturer of hydroxychloroquine, which, of course, we all know President Trump has been touting most loudly for as a cure or prophylactic. So if you take these together, so what the experts I've spoken with have said is that there isn't evidence that all of this is true. Some of these seem perhaps more promising theories than others, such as BCG. The warm weather one does not sound promising at all. And if that's the case, then it's really a question of how efficient the government measures are and how cooperative society is to see how this eventually pans out in India.
So, Tanvi, I want to ask you about those government measures. I mean, back in March now, Narendra Modi announced a 21-day nationwide lockdown. He recently extended that until May 3rd, after which point the country may begin to open up, on a staggered basis. In terms of its domestic response, India has been written about really in all sorts of publications about instituting some of the most stringent measures of any country on earth. And many are saying that, maybe those measures were, in fact, too harsh. What do you think about that?
I think, one of the things as we look globally, governments have had to make choices. And one thing is evident, we know what wrong choices look like. We know that from the experience here. But there are no perfect choices. And I think this is where it's very easy to second guess, but it's hard to know without knowing what the counterfactual would be, that had they not done this, what would the situation look like? And I think what we see is that this was the result of a cost-benefit analysis on the part of the government, recognizing that there would be, especially economic consequences, but that, making the judgment that the public health and economic impact, the adverse impact of a massive spread at the scale it would spread perhaps in India, keeping that in mind, that this, particularly the national lockdown, was worth it. And I think, if you think about it, what they have to figure, it's just the sheer size of India. So it's the combination of the potential scale of the spread, and then combine that with the kind of burden that would impose on India's limited healthcare infrastructure and the economic, adverse impact of that. So I think you can understand why the government made that decision. Unfortunately, when you're doing these cost-benefit analysis, what we're seeing is that the costs are not distributed evenly. The consequences have been harsher for some, particularly lower income groups, migrant workers. And so I think it is a valid question to ask if more could have been done to anticipate some of the fallout or mitigate it or even prevent it. And it's a valid question to ask what further steps the governments at the central and state level, as well as kind of non-governmental entities, will be taking to make sure that these groups are taken care of. I think overall you'll have a lot of experts say that they do think that the lockdown would have slowed the spread. But I don't think we know, and I think it's hard to make a judgment till we know how much has it slowed it. Has the government used this time that it has bought to prepare for the further spread, but also, to institute and plan for some of those economic measures? And then, how the other question we don't have an answer to is, how do you actually take a country out of this kind of lockdown? And what is going to be the consequence of that? How will that play out? And will there be future waves? So I think there's a lot unknown, but as Joan Lai would say, it's too soon to say. So I wouldn't want to kind of say this was a wrong move, because I don't think we know what the alternative would have been. And everything suggests it would be a lot worse.
I sort of more or less agree with Tanvi, but I look at it a little bit differently. I think that sort of you could divide this into two parts, and one is the question of timing, and then the second is the question of manner. Now, when you look at the question of timing, the people I spoke with, there was basically divided opinion. One leading expert said that, look, the government did the right thing and they moved at the right time. Another one said that, look, they basically lost the month of February and they moved in a panic when they did. They should have moved earlier. So over there, I would say there's divided opinion. And in the defense of the government, I think it's fair to say that no matter, it's impossible to sort of get this absolutely right. Naturally, it's going to be messy. Where the criticism is valid is on the question of the manner, how they chose to do this, just giving people just a few hours of notice. That, I think, was particularly brutal and ham-handed. Brought to mind other government decisions such as Nati Demon. And I think it could have been done. They could have done this and given people a little bit more notice, so that you didn't have scenes like these migrant workers who were stranded or have been found hiding in trucks and so on. So some of that acute misery that we can trace directly to the lack of notice, I think it is fair to raise that set of questions.
So now, in response to some of the domestic criticism the Modi government is getting from all sides, it has pivoted, and supporters of the government have pivoted to the issue of China. Sadanand, you wrote a column, I think it was about 3 weeks ago, titled "Delhi Isn't Buying Beijing's Coronavirus Hero Act." Describe for us, the sort of vehement anti-China sentiment that seems to have taken hold across India. I would just note that this isn't just coming from government and government supporters. It's actually coming, if social media is any guide, from, kind of across the political, ideological spectrum.
Oh, absolutely. And I think no one has done a better job of documenting this than, in fact, Tanvi. And I first sort of came across this on her Twitter feed. And I was struck by the, things like Amitabh Bachchan, major Bollywood superstar, tweeting this image of the head of the WHO blindfolded with a Chinese with the Chinese flag. He, of course, later deleted that tweet. And the fact that many people who you would not normally expect to be sort of part of this were forwarding memes. I had friends sending me stuff on WhatsApp, some of it sort of cultural stereotypes. But there's a lot of anger directed towards the Chinese. And there's a sense that the Chinese playbook, which appears to be to sort of reach out to people and talk about and point to, first of all, how well they say they have in fact contained the pandemic, but also then now to play the role of helping people who are in need. My sense was that in India, at least, no one is buying that, and there's a tremendous amount of anger that this disruption has been caused by China.
Tanvi, you have studied India-China relations for many years and, in fact, just wrote a book about them. Are we approaching a low point in bilateral relations? Because, what's striking to me is that India's anti-China rhetoric may actually be outpacing America's, which seems like a shift. I remember we talked about this when we discussed your book on this podcast. It was a comment that Kurt Campbell made at your book launch, which is Americans, when it comes to the role China plays in U.S.-India ties, often, that we say the quiet part out loud. Now Indians seem to be doing that. So, is there, something new and different going on here?
So I draw a distinction here, and this is where, I think Kurt's point is valid. So the distinction I draw here is that the Indian government's rhetoric has actually been quite measured. And it's been measured because, both the Indian government from a strategic perspective wants to keep the China relationship stable, as it often does at moments like this when there's uncertainty and crisis, but also because India needs to procure medical supplies from China and ingredients, for example, for its pharmaceutical industry. And so it doesn't want to kind of poke China in the nose by going on the offensive publicly. And so its rhetoric has been nothing like the Trump administration's rhetoric targeting China. Even though, as Kurt pointed out, like previous times, the Indian government actually shares many of the same concerns that the Trump administration has about China and its behavior and approach, both in the initial stages in the crisis, but also more recently. I think what is kind of been outpacing the U.S. Is the Indian establishment and public's rhetoric, which then what you see in the U.S., and that's what Sadanand was talking about as well. And in that sense, I don't know if it's a shift as much as it's a reinforcement, both on the part of the government and the public and the establishment. It's a reinforcement of their views, or maybe an intensification of existing concerns and perceptions, skeptical perceptions that both the Indian government and the public share about China. And some of these concerns include, and we're seeing existing concerns now becoming a lot less abstract for the Indian public. And these concerns are everything from over-dependence on China for industrial inputs to China's influence in international organizations, to China taking diplomatic or economic advantage of the situation, whether that's by increasing its influence in India's neighborhood, or kind of acquiring Indian companies, or kind of China trying to use this moment to improve its image, or kind of especially relative to the US around the world, and make the case for its system. I think there are a few things to watch in terms of where we see potential changes in the future. I mean, one, we're going to talk about it, but some of these changes India has made to its investment policies that are related to China. Do we see China actually retaliate, and then how does the Indian government respond? Does it back down, and how is that received at home, or does it make some adjustments, or does it just follow through? Does China learn? It has, one of the things that's kind of upset people is it's kind of what are seen as propaganda efforts. It's seen as condescending towards India. So does the Chinese kind of diplomatic establishment realize they need to dial down on that stuff? I think the other set of people to watch is, whenever these Pew surveys are done, China already has a pretty low favorability rating in India. It was 23% in the last, I think, Pew survey, and 46%, I think, had a unfavorable view. That's a lot of I don't knows. That's about 30%, just over 30% who say I don't know. And are we going to see less people who say they don't have an opinion of China because they're getting, these memes on WhatsApp or things? And do they move to that kind of unfavorable category? And finally, just two other things. One, do you start to see, like we've seen in the US, when the Trump administration went to overdrive, you started as almost a reaction. A number of constituencies speak out in support of China and cooperation with China. Do you start to see that in India, and particularly maybe from the business sector, or from people who are worried that this will go kind of overboard? And then finally, this is kind of the wild card that I've been thinking about, is what happens to perceptions of China and India if China is the first country to develop a vaccine? And what does that do to the narrative?
I mean, Tanvi, let me just stick with you on this for a second. We discussed these new investment curbs India introduced. Tell us what they do, and what do you think the broader significance of those moves are? And then Sadanand, I want to get your take on that as well.
So I think, it is a recognition of something that's been happening for a while, which is that, like a number of countries, India has wanted Chinese capital, of which it has actually got very little compared to other countries. So the official estimates are kind of FDI cumulative into India is about less than $3 billion. If you add, Hong Kong investment from Hong Kong, etc., people estimate it's anywhere from, some people estimate 6 billion, some estimate 8, some estimate up to 12 billion if you count all sources. But I think there's been an increasing recognition in India that this capital comes with costs. And so how do you ensure that how do you deal with those costs? Now, you've seen these kind of changes in investment screening processes in a number of countries, Australia, European countries, the US obviously already has CFIUS. So for India to announce, and India's kind of policy decision that was announced is significant because, for one, it's part of this broader move towards concern in particular about Chinese investment. But second, the fact that it's actually, despite the fact that it didn't name China, it was clearly targeted at China, it clearly kind of does show that India, knowing that China would be quite upset about this, was concerned enough that it was willing to take this step, knowing that there could be potential retaliation from China. So let me just talk about kind of the one thing that we know has happened, and the other thing that has been reported, but we haven't seen confirmation. So what has been announced in a press note, and I heard an interesting discussion today with some analysts pointing out that this press note is just a policy decision. The laws haven't been amended, so we don't know a lot of the details. But the Indian government's, what it announced was increased scrutiny of foreign direct investment from countries that share a land boundary with India. So China's not mentioned, but because there are already restrictions on Pakistani citizens, this does seem, and the Chinese have read it as, directed against them. This is not a ban. What this means is that this kind of investment will require government approval. It will have to go through the government route. The second thing that we've heard reported, but we have not seen kind of confirmation, the reports have said that they have seen the memos, which is the government urging the Securities and Exchange Board of India to increase its scrutiny of foreign portfolio investments from China and Hong Kong. And that could actually potentially have a lot of implications, a lot broader implications. And usually FDI and FBI policies are aligned, so this wouldn't be surprising if that's the case. So these are the kind of things to watch, how they evolve. I think we'll see kind of various adjustments as even the Indian government will become aware of things they haven't thought of in terms of consequences. I think we'll see a lot more clarity in terms of what this means. We'll have to see how it actually functions. Are they able to make distinctions between kind of investments that they want versus making sure it's only kind of investments in sectors that are that are seen as national security or economically sensitive, or does this become blanket and just discourages investment more broadly? I think over time, what we're going to see, what we're likely to see, is a kind of a rehaul or rethinking of India's investment screening process more broadly, because I think there'll be just too many loopholes, too many kind of things to think about, and this might be seen as too broad. And where India's kind of policy decision is different, and India might actually end up aligning over time with more global practices, which is not to do country specific, or is either to go for a sector specific or a kind of set of guidelines, or have something that is more kind of a broader process. And then you have guidelines within that. So it's not targeting one country, but it very conceivably could. And that's actually almost going back to the older system that India had.
I mean, Sadanand, you have written critically, I think it's fair to say, of the Modi government's majoritarian push particularly in the first 9 months of its second term since coming back to power in May 2019. Communalism has kind of reared its ugly head in the COVID era as well, as a large Islamic religious gathering in Delhi is being singled out as a quote-unquote super spreader of the virus. Is this a narrative operating on the fringes, or do you think it finds buyers and endorsement in the quarters of power?
I wish I could say this was a narrative on the fringes. Unfortunately, it is absolutely a mainstream narrative. It has been pushed by numerous television channels. It has been pushed by Twitter handles associated with the ruling party. It has been talked about in government briefings and so on. And I'm not out here to defend the Tablighi Jamaat or any other group that held a gathering. But I do want to point out a couple of things. The first is that the gathering that was held before the lockdown. It was held when there was a great deal of normalcy in India. Parliament was still in session, for example. The second point is that many groups have been holding gatherings, including some religious gatherings have been held after the lockdown. And thirdly, I think that at least it seems that to pull out the Tablighi Jamaat numbers and say that, look, this percentage, a very high percentage of positive cases have been traced to that gathering. I think that's certainly fine to say that, but you have to add the caveat, which is that these people are being tested more aggressively. And so obviously, if you go looking for them and you test them to a large degree, you're going to get disproportionately you're going to get more cases. And the experts I spoke with on this said that this was obviously an unfortunate incident. Would it have been better if they had not gathered? Would it have been better if they had then not returned to their villages and towns and taken the disease with them? Of course, it would have been better. But that statistically speaking, it does not make sense to pin this on the Tablighi Jamaat. And frankly, the part that I find much more worrying is that large sections of the media, and certainly on social media, people have kind of turned the Tablighi Jamaat gathering into a kind of proxy for the Muslim community more broadly. And coming after this, increased tensions that we've seen, particularly since the Modi government's re-election in 2019, I think it's very unfortunate. On the bright side, I'll say that it was good to see that the Prime Minister put out a tweet where he pointed out that the coronavirus does not discriminate in terms of religion, caste, or any other metric. And I hope that there'd be some sense of responsibility and some kind of realization that the last thing that India needs at a moment like this, is to sort of play Hindu-Muslim politics. And the thing that it needs most is to come together as a nation to fight this.
Tanvi, some have argued that, how Modi responds to the coronavirus is going to make or break his legacy. In fact, I think, Sadanand, you made that point explicitly in your last column. As of today, again, recording on April 20th, it looks like the Prime Minister's popularity is, firmly intact. Is there a scenario you could envision that fundamentally changes this?
I think, I wouldn't be surprised if the Prime Minister himself thinks this could make or break or even, redeem his legacy with certain kind of international constituencies if he thinks that's been damaged. I mean, it could explain why he's taken this move. It's high risk, high reward. But it also explains, one thing that's been striking is how much more visible he's been in the last kind of month or so than he was in kind of the previous 6 months. Kind of, if you think January and the 6 months before that, we did not see much of him. And so, he has he has put his face on this. And that has helped in some ways because he does have traction with large segments of the Indian population that will listen to him on a number of issues. Now, what could change it? I think the most obvious one is if there is a major deterioration of the situation, whether that's on the public health side or there's serious economic damage that will take a while, and particularly certain kind of segments that favor him, whether that's kind of small business owners or, he's had support from rural areas in the past, though that we have seen that there's some unhappiness there already in some of the state elections. But if they feel that, they are paying the costs of something that is seen as an urban problem. So if there's a significant, I think the deterioration, though, would have to be significant. Having said that, this, just like Ronald Reagan was the Teflon president, Modi thus far has kind of been the Teflon prime minister, at least at home. And so you can always see, there will be other fall guys if there's a problem, whether that's China, whether that's state governments, or whether that's, Muslims for that matter, that there will be, others who will kind of be pointed to as the reason for failure. I would say what could change kind of the legacy issue again, there's one more issue that I'd point to. I think it's what kind of the government does when India emerges from this. I mean, obviously, it also depends on the state in which India emerges. But what does the government do as it emerges? Does the government return to status quo ante? Does it go for restoration rather than reform or even a renaissance? And I actually think that will leave people disappointed at Modi and perhaps even raise you'll see some of the questions that were being raised before January. Because if you think about where we were a couple of months ago, Modi had faced domestic political setbacks. The economic growth rate was slowing, having fallen below 5% and expected to fall further. His international image had been dented. And so if the idea, and, at the communal issues that and the divisiveness and the polarization that Sadanand just talked about was had become what everybody was focused on. And so if during the course, as this crisis plays out, but particularly after, there's the sense of, you could just go back and hit a reset button, or the elements that look to take advantage of this crisis to push forward their political agendas. I think you will see people, I think it will have some impact on the Prime Minister's legacy. Having said that, this also therefore offers a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity for both India and this Prime Minister, that he can actually take advantage. I mean, crises can sometimes be when you can take some tough decisions for kind of that revival or renaissance, reform. So far, the government has been reluctant to take some of those decisions, whether on the economic side, particularly on the economic side. But there's an opportunity that could be there for India. And if the Prime Minister takes it, I think he could, in fact, his legacy could perhaps improve even domestically. So I think it will really depend on how things play out over the next few months and what the government does in the aftermath.
So I want to end by asking you guys two questions. We're going to forego the traditional best week, worst week, because let's face it, I think everyone is having a bad week. This is why we're starting happy hour at 4:30 p.m. But let me start with you, Sadanand. Is there a story in India, or maybe even an angle to the coronavirus story in India that our listeners should be following but might not be focused on at the present moment?
I think it's the angle that, Tanvi just touched upon. Which is, how is this going to affect Indian federalism? And it's going to be fascinating, in particular, to watch strong state-level leaders, people like Mamata Banerjee, people like Naveen Patnaik, because this rally around the flag effect that we are seeing at a national level may also play out at a state level. And we're also likely to see as the resource constraints rise, is a kind of, nativism in some places. So I'd be very curious to see how the state governments and the Modi government basically negotiate center-state relations over the next 18 to 24 months. It'll be fascinating to watch.
Tanvi, what about you? Is there a story out there in India that our listeners should be reading or paying attention to?
So, I've got two. One, things to pay attention to. The other, what I'm reading right now, which is about India's epidemic surveillance system, which is quite elaborate because of its experience with epidemics and pandemics. And some have actually said that one of the reasons they can actually do so much contact tracing is because of this network of public health workers who has experience, and particularly they have a network in rural areas and in urban slums. So I'm just kind of fascinated by that. Linked to that is a US-India thing where the US CDC helped India CDC build an epidemic intelligence service, which sounds kind of cool to me. But what I'm actually paying attention to, and I think it's worth people who are focused on the geopolitical dynamics of this, is I've been somewhat surprised, to see some former diplomats in China hands, two former foreign secretaries who are both China hands, coming out and particularly linking the problem of China's behavior as linking it to a lack of democracy. Usually, there's criticism of China when people retire. People will come out and say things they couldn't in government. But both Shyam Saran and Vijay Gokhale, I think it is a departure for retired Indian diplomats to particularly talk about not just China's lack of democracy and why it's a problem, because usually they say, oh, it doesn't matter, we have relations with whatever country, whatever their system or regime. But also that both of them had made the case for India then as needing to show itself as a model, as a non-China. That is, India as a democracy needs to show that it can succeed, because then it can help prove the case that democracies can be effective as well. And so you're kind of making the case for both India as a model in a kind of non-China way, so explicitly, but also, frankly, their criticism of China's lack of democracy, which I haven't seen before.
Okay, and I want to end by asking both of you, has nothing to do with India or the podcast, but just curious at a personal level, is there sort of one thing that's kept you sane during this era of social distancing? I mean, we see people, apparently everyone's become, a bread baker. People have become expert gardeners. Sadanand, what is it that is keeping you going during this extended quarantine?
Well, other people will have to be the judge of whether I'm sane or not. But
your Twitter followers clearly think not.
Exactly. My very calm and sensible Twitter followers. I'd say two things really. First, of course, it's Rock Creek Park. I've been going on long 7-mile walks every day almost, and that has been absolutely fantastic. The weather has been quite nice, and it's just been great to stretch my legs and do that quite routinely. And the second is cooking. I just made what I hope is a really nice Thai salmon curry. And
for those who aren't following Sadanand, I guess on Facebook is where you're doing this. You seem to have a daily tree update where you're posting a new beautiful picture of a lovely blossoming tree every single day.
Trying to just share something pretty. Yeah. Both on Facebook and on Twitter, in this moment.
Tanvi, what about you? What's getting you out of bed and pushing forward?
So I have to say, I have been wondering how Sadanand picks that particular tree every day. Like, what is the criteria? And can trees apply for them to be nominated? For me, it's been, I think, one. Being able to, I think there's three things: the outside, internet, and a glass of wine. And I think the outside, just because I'm particularly aware as I talk to my parents who are in India, that we can actually still go outside. We can go for walks. And, when I hear my parents, they're sitting on the balcony, I can hear in the background the police guys going around in a kind of a jeep, going around with a loudspeaker, trying to get all the aunties and uncles who are attempting to stealthily take their evening walks that they need to go back inside. I'm aware of how lucky we are in many ways, despite all the restrictions that we do have. I think the internet, because for all its kind of drawbacks, and we often joke about kind of trolls on Twitter and stuff. But not just it's allowed this communication and access with people that we just wouldn't have had otherwise, whether that's through social media, whether that's seeing, colleagues and friends and family on video teleconferences, which I think we'll probably all be sick of soon. But nonetheless, it's to have that human connection, to have engagement and discussion. I'm a social person. That's really helped. And then finally, can't really do, the glass of wine in the evening has been very, very important in keeping me sane.
Spoken like a true Punjabi. I will say
no. A true Punjabi would have had the whole bottle.
Yeah, maybe wine is too mild. I would just say, to echo what both of you have said, the outside has been really key. Although it's introduced this new stress because we adopted a second dog a couple of months ago, who is a true hunter. And she has tried in the past couple of months to break out of our backyard several times, successfully on three different occasions. So we've gotten her now a Wi-Fi enabled collar, just in case she does break out. We know how to find her. But one of the things that this collar does is it records her daily steps. And so we keep getting alerts about her step count. And so now we're in this race because it ranks your dog against every other dog who has this electronic collar. So apparently she is 27th of all dogs who have this electronic collar. And she's getting, 6 to 7 miles a day, but apparently that is not enough to get her out of the mid-20s. So we clearly have some work to do in the weeks and months
ahead. This is such a DC
ahead.
thing.
I thought I would end on that, what was meant to be a happy note, but you could see the undercurrent of stress. My guests today are podcast regular Sadanand Dhume of the American Enterprise Institute and the Wall Street Journal, and Tanvi Madan of the Brookings Institution. Guys, thanks so much for doing this. Cheers. Thanks for joining us for this happy hour, and hope to have you on before too long. Although I fear that when we do this next time, it's going to be virtual once again.
Well, it's great to chat with you all in these COVID times in particular. Hope to do this in person next time, though. I still have hope.
Yeah, I think the happy hour is a good innovation, Milan, and I think maybe we should stick with it.
Yeah, it's the only way that we're going to get through these distressing and strange times. Guys, thanks so much, and talk to you soon. Grant Tamasha is a co-production of the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace and the Hindustan Times. You can find us on iTunes or wherever you get your podcasts. Don't forget to rate and review. It helps others find the show more easily. For more information about the show and to find the writing we referenced on this week's episode, visit our website, granttamasha.com. Production assistance comes from Megan Maxwell and Rachel Osnos. Tim Martin is our audio engineer, and Lauren Dueck is our executive producer. Thanks for listening, and see you next week.